Her aunt's fingers closed around the lace at her collar and tore downward. The sound of ripping fabric echoed through the church like a scream. 300 guests sat in silence as the most important woman in Venetia Langley's life stripped her bare, not of clothing, but of every scrap of dignity she had left. "You are nothing," Lady Sybil hissed, loud enough for the front 6 pews to hear. "You have always been nothing." She was wrong, but it would take the most powerful duke in England to prove it. Welcome to aristocratic hearts. She had nothing. He had everything. Society said they could never be equals. But when a duke decides he wants something or someone, there's no force in England powerful enough to stop him. Welcome back to aristocratic hearts. I've been waiting to share this story with you. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Whether you're curled up in bed, on your morning commute, or taking a break from the chaos of life, I want to know. Drop your city and your local time in the comments. Tonight's story is about a woman who was publicly destroyed on what should have been the happiest day of her life, and the man who had been watching her for 6 years, waiting for the moment he could finally step out of the shadows. It is about cruelty so brazen it will make your blood boil, and revenge so complete it will make you smile. But more than anything, it is about being seen, truly seen, by the one person who matters. Let me take you to the spring of 1852, to a small parish church in Hertfordshire, where the scent of lilies hung heavy in the air, and 300 of England's finest had gathered to witness a wedding that would never happen. To understand what happened at that altar, you must first understand Venetia Langley. She was 22 years old, dark-haired, gray-eyed, and possessed of the kind of quiet beauty that most people overlooked entirely. Not because it was not there, but because Venetia had spent the better part of 8 years learning to make herself invisible. She moved through rooms like a shadow. She spoke only when addressed. She kept her gaze lowered, her opinions locked behind her teeth, and her hands perpetually busy with whatever task her aunt had assigned her that day, mending, polishing silver, copying correspondence, arranging flowers that she would never be permitted to enjoy. She had not always been this way. Once, she had been the daughter of Sir Edmund Langley and his wife, the former Miss Clara Ashton, a family of comfortable means, good breeding, and genuine warmth. They had lived in a handsome house in Cambridgeshire with a garden that her mother tended herself, despite having servants who would have done it gladly. Venetia remembered summer afternoons lying on a blanket beneath the apple tree, while her father read aloud from novels he pretended were too frivolous for his taste. She remembered her mother's laugh, bright and sudden, like a bird startled into flight. She remembered being loved without condition, without reservation, without the constant gnawing fear that it might be taken away. It was taken away on a Tuesday in November, when Venetia was 14 years old. The carriage accident killed both her parents instantly. The driver survived. Venetia, who had stayed home with a head cold, survived. And in the space of a single afternoon, she went from being the cherished only daughter of a loving family to being an orphan with no siblings, no close relations, and no one in the world who particularly cared whether she lived or died. No one, that is, except her father's sister, Lady Sybil Langley. Now, it is important to understand what guardianship meant for an orphaned girl in 1844 England. The law offered her no voice, no choice, and no protection. When the courts appointed Lady Sybil as Venetia's guardian, they handed over not merely the care of a child, but the control of her modest inheritance, approximately £3,000 in funds, and a small annual income from her father's investments. Venetia had no solicitor of her own, no advocate, no one to ensure that the money set aside for her future was actually used for her future. She was, in the eyes of the law, property to be managed. And Lady Sybil managed her with the efficiency of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. The house in Cambridgeshire was sold within 2 months. Venetia's belongings were packed into a single trunk. Her mother's jewelry, not valuable by aristocratic standards, but precious beyond measure to a grieving 14-year-old, disappeared into Lady Sybil's dressing room and was never mentioned again. Venetia was installed in her aunt's house in Hertfordshire, not in a proper bedchamber, but in a small room at the top of the servants' staircase, a room so narrow that she could touch both walls if she stretched out her arms. She was given 3 dresses, none of them new. She was informed that her education would continue, but only in those subjects Lady Sybil deemed appropriate: needlework, deportment, and household management. The books her father had given her were removed from her trunk and placed in the library, where she was not permitted to go without permission. And then there was Maud. Maud Langley was Lady Sybil's daughter, the same age as Venetia, but in every other respect her opposite. Where Venetia was dark-haired and gray-eyed, Maud was golden and pink-cheeked. Where Venetia was quiet, Maud was loud. Where Venetia was thoughtful, Maud was impulsive. And where Venetia had lost everything, Maud had been given everything, including, it seemed, the right to treat her cousin as something between a servant and a pet. It was Maud who, first, called her worthless. They were 16. Venetia had been living in her aunt's house for 2 years, and whatever hope she had harbored that her situation might improve had long since evaporated like morning dew. She was sitting in the drawing-room, mending one of Maud's torn petticoats, when Maud swept in with 3 of her friends, girls from neighboring estates who had come for tea. "Oh, don't mind her," Maud said, waving a careless hand in Venetia's direction. "That's just my cousin. She's worthless, really, but Mama keeps her on out of charity." The girls laughed. Venetia's needle pierced her finger. A single drop of blood fell onto the white petticoat, and Maud shrieked as though Venetia had stabbed her. That night, Lady Sybil came to Venetia's room and informed her, in a voice as cold as January marble, that she was an ungrateful, clumsy, worthless girl, who would never amount to anything, and that if she could not even perform simple mending without making a mess, perhaps she would be better suited to scrubbing floors. Venetia did not cry. She had learned by then that tears were a currency that bought nothing in this house. The years passed. Venetia turned 17, 18, 19. She watched from the servants' staircase as Maud was fitted for ball gowns. She watched from the kitchen garden as Maud was driven to the London season in a polished carriage. She watched from the shadows as suitors came and went, as flowers arrived, as her cousin's future was built with the money that should have been Venetia's own. Because that was the truth Lady Sybil had hidden with meticulous care. Venetia's inheritance was gone. Every penny of the £3,000, every shilling of the annual income, had been quietly absorbed into the household accounts, used to fund Maud's wardrobe, Maud's season, Maud's prospects. When Venetia turned 21 and should have received her funds, Lady Sybil presented her with a ledger, showing that the cost of her room, board, and upkeep over 7 years had exceeded her inheritance by a considerable sum. "You owe me, child," Lady Sybil said, turning the pages with a manicured fingernail. "If anything, I have been too generous." Venetia had no way to challenge this. She had no solicitor, no friends in positions of authority, no knowledge of the law beyond what she had gleaned from the books she read in secret, borrowed from the library when no one was watching. She was trapped, completely, thoroughly, and deliberately trapped. And then Lord Jasper Trent arrived. He was 31, fair-haired, pleasant-faced, and utterly, irredeemably broke. The youngest son of a minor baron, he had spent his 20s gambling away whatever modest expectations he had possessed, and was now in desperate need of a wife with funds. Lady Sybil, who had been corresponding with him for months, presented him with a proposition: marry Venetia, and Lady Sybil would provide a dowry of £1,000. It was, of course, Venetia's own money, the last remaining portion of her inheritance, which Lady Sybil had kept in reserve for precisely this purpose, not to benefit Venetia, but to rid herself of the girl once and for all. The proposal was made on a Thursday. Venetia was not consulted. She was informed. "You will marry Lord Trent on the 15th of April," Lady Sybil said in the same tone she used to instruct the cook about dinner. "You should be grateful. No other man would have you." Venetia looked at Lord Trent across the drawing-room. His easy smile, his restless eyes, the way his gaze lingered on the silver candlesticks, as though calculating their value, and felt something cold settle in her stomach. But what choice did she have? A woman of 22, with no money, no connections, and no legal standing, could not refuse a match arranged by her guardian. She could not rent rooms of her own, could not seek employment without a reference, could not exist independently in any meaningful way. The world outside Lady Sybil's house was as inaccessible to her as the far side of the moon. She said yes. What else was there to say? The wedding was arranged with unseemly haste. Lady Sybil wanted the thing done before Venetia could think too carefully, before questions could be asked, before anyone might look too closely at the financial arrangements underpinning the match. The church was booked. The banns were read. Venetia was given a wedding dress, not a new one, naturally, but one of Lady Sybil's old gowns, hastily altered and trimmed with fresh lace to disguise its age. On the morning of April the 15th, Venetia stood before the small mirror in her narrow room and looked at herself in the borrowed dress. The lace was yellowing at the edges. The bodice did not quite fit. The woman staring back at her had shadows under her eyes and a mouth that had forgotten how to smile. "This is my life," she whispered to her reflection. "This is what it has come to." She did not know that 6 pews from the back of that church, a man was already seated, a man who had been watching her for 6 years with an intensity that would have terrified her had she known. A man who had come to that church not to witness a wedding, but to stop one. His name was Alistair Graves. He was the Duke of Harrogate, and he was about to change everything. Now, before we step inside that church, I need to tell you about Alistair. He was 33 years old, tall, dark-haired, and possessed of a face that seemed carved from granite, all sharp angles and hard lines, softened only by eyes the color of a winter sea. He was, by any measure, one of the most powerful men in England. His income exceeded £40,000 a year. His estates sprawled across 3 counties. His name, spoken in the corridors of Parliament or whispered in the drawing-rooms of Mayfair, carried the weight of generations. And he was, by unanimous agreement, terrifying. Not cruel, not violent, not unkind, but terrifying in the way that a storm is terrifying, vast, elemental, impossible to predict or control. He spoke rarely and never wasted words. He moved through society with the unhurried confidence of a man who knew that every door would open for him and every head would bow. He had been courted by the most beautiful women in England and had refused them all with a politeness so absolute it felt like a wall. Society had theories, of course. Society always did. Some said he was nursing a broken heart. Others said he was incapable of love entirely, that whatever organ occupied his chest was made of the same cold stone as his family's ancestral seat. A few of the more imaginative gossips suggested darker explanations, whispered behind fans and over teacups. But none of them came close to the truth. The truth was this. Alistair Graves had been in love with Venetia Langley since the autumn of 1846, when he had seen her for the first and most devastating time. He had been riding through Hertfordshire on business, a matter of land boundaries that required his personal attention, when his horse threw a shoe near the village of Aldbury. While his groom attended to the animal, Alistair had walked to the parish church to wait, and there, in the churchyard, he had seen a young woman of perhaps 16 kneeling beside a grave. She was pulling weeds from around the headstone with her bare hands. Her dress was thin and mended at the elbows. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins and fell around her face like a curtain. She was crying, not dramatically, not performatively, but with the quiet, steady grief of someone who had long since exhausted the luxury of sobbing and was left with nothing but silent, relentless tears. He had not spoken to her. He had not approached. He had stood in the shadow of the church wall and watched her tend her parents' grave with a tenderness that cracked something open inside his chest. Something he had not known was sealed shut. He asked the groom who she was. The groom asked the blacksmith. The blacksmith knew the vicar, and by the following morning, Alistair knew her name, her history, and the broad strokes of her situation. He also knew, with a certainty that settled into his bones like iron, that he would not forget her. I have to pause here and tell you, this next part is what keeps me up at night when I'm writing these stories. Because what Alistair did over the next 6 years was not normal. It was not healthy by any modern standard. It was obsession in its purest, most consuming form. He investigated, quietly, methodically, with the resources of a man who could afford the best solicitors and the most discreet inquiry agents in England. He learned about Lady Sybil's theft of Venetia's inheritance. He obtained copies of the financial records. He documented every indignity, every cruelty, every stolen shilling. He built a case so thorough, so devastating, so utterly airtight, that when the time came to deploy it, there would be no defense, no excuse, no escape. But he did not act. Not yet. Because Venetia was still a minor under her aunt's guardianship, and any intervention would have been complicated by legal entanglements that could have dragged on for years. So he waited. He waited with the discipline of a man accustomed to playing very long games, and while he waited, he watched. He had a man in the village, a retired solicitor's clerk named Mr. Poole, who sent him monthly reports. Miss Langley is well, but thin. Miss Langley was not permitted to attend the harvest festival. Miss Langley was seen carrying firewood from the shed, a task that should fall to a servant. The reports were clinical, factual, and each one burned a little, deeper into Alistair's resolve. He kept every letter. He kept them in a leather case in the top drawer of his desk at Harrogate Park, arranged by date, tied with a ribbon the same gray as her eyes, though he would never have admitted this detail to a living soul. And then, in February of 1852, the report that changed everything. Miss Langley's guardian has arranged a marriage to a Lord Jasper Trent. The wedding is set for April. Alistair had read those words, set the letter down, and sat in perfect stillness for approximately 4 minutes. Then he had summoned his solicitor, his steward, and his valet, and he had begun to move. The church of St. Michael's in Aldbury was old and beautiful, built of flint and chalk in the manner of Hertfordshire churches, with a square tower that could be seen from miles across the gently rolling countryside. On the morning of April the 15th, it was filled with flowers. Lady Sybil had insisted on a display that exceeded her budget, determined that the wedding should appear respectable, even if the bride was not. 300 guests were seated. This was a social event as much as a sacrament, an opportunity for Lady Sybil to demonstrate her generosity in disposing of her troublesome niece, and for the neighborhood to witness the spectacle. Lord Trent stood at the altar, handsome in his borrowed finery, smiling the smile of a man who believed his financial troubles were about to end. And in the back pew, alone, unnoticed by the crowd, Alistair Graves sat with his hands resting on his thighs, and his eyes fixed on the door through which Venetia would enter. She appeared. She was pale. She was thin. The dress did not fit properly. It bunched at the waist and sagged at the shoulders, and the yellowed lace at the collar seemed to mock rather than adorn her. She carried no flowers. She had no bridesmaids. She walked alone down the aisle of a church full of people, and not one of them looked at her with anything warmer than curiosity. Alistair's hands tightened on his thighs until his knuckles went white. She reached the altar. The vicar opened his book, and then, "One moment, if you please." The voice came from the 5th pew. Lord Trent's mother, a sharp-faced woman named Lady Constance Trent, rose to her feet with an expression that could have curdled milk. "Before this ceremony proceeds," Lady Constance said, her voice cutting through the murmur of the congregation, "I would like to know the precise terms of the dowry settlement. My son was promised £1,000. I have made inquiries, and I have reason to believe the funds in question do not, in fact, belong to Lady Sybil." The silence that followed was absolute. Lady Sybil's face went rigid. "I don't know what you mean. The dowry has been arranged." "Arranged from whose pocket?" Lady Constance pressed. "My solicitor has reviewed the Langley estate papers. The funds you are offering were left to Miss Langley by her late father. You have no legal right to them." Whispers erupted like fire through dry grass. Venetia stood frozen at the altar, her borrowed bouquet trembling in her hands, understanding with horrible clarity that she was not the bride at this wedding. She was the currency. And then Lady Sybil did the unforgivable thing. Perhaps it was panic. Perhaps it was the fury of a woman whose carefully constructed scheme was unraveling in public. Perhaps it was simply the cruelty that had always lived beneath her polished exterior, finally given permission to show its face. Whatever the reason, Lady Sybil turned on Venetia with a rage so sudden and so vicious that the women in the front pews gasped. "This," Lady Sybil snarled, seizing the lace at Venetia's collar, "is what you have brought upon this family." She pulled. The aged lace tore away in her hand with a sound like a crack of thunder. The bodice beneath, thin, poorly stitched, clearly the work of hasty alteration, gaped open at the shoulder, exposing the worn cotton of Venetia's chemise beneath. But Lady Sybil was not finished. "You want to know what she's worth?" Lady Sybil turned to the congregation, holding the torn lace aloft like evidence. Nothing. She is worth nothing. I took her in out of the goodness of my heart. I fed her, clothed her, kept a roof over her ungrateful head for 8 years. And this is how she repays me. By ruining my daughter's prospects, by embarrassing this family, by standing at an altar in a dress she doesn't deserve, pretending to be something she is not. Maud was on her feet now, her pretty face twisted with a spite that mirrored her mother's. She crossed to Venetia and seized the sleeve of the dress, the last intact sleeve, and pulled it downward. The torn fabric, already weakened by age and alteration, gave way immediately. The entire left side of the bodice collapsed, and Venetia was left standing at the altar in the ruins of a borrowed gown, her arms wrapped around herself, her face white as bone. No one moved to help her. Let me say that again, because I need you to understand the full weight of this moment. 300 people sat in that church. 300 men and women of supposedly good breeding, Christian charity, and social conscience, and not a single one of them rose from their pew. Not one offered a shawl. Not one said a word. Lord Trent stepped backward from the altar as though Venetia were contagious. "I will not marry this girl," he said, adjusting his cuffs. The arrangement was clearly made under false pretenses. "Worthless," Lady Sybil repeated, the word ringing through the vaulted ceiling like a bell. "Worthless, worthless, worthless." Venetia stood perfectly still. She did not cry. She did not scream. She did not beg. She simply stood there, in the wreckage of her dress and her dignity, and looked at the stone floor beneath her feet with the blank, devastated expression of someone who has finally, irrevocably given up. And then a voice spoke from the back of the church. "That is quite enough." It was not loud. It was not shouted. It was spoken with the quiet, absolute authority of a man who has never once in his life needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. Every head in the church turned. Alistair Graves, Duke of Harrogate, rose from the back pew. He was dressed in black, immaculate, severe, as though he had arrived not for a wedding, but for a reckoning. He moved down the aisle with the unhurried precision of a man who owned every room he entered, and the crowd parted before him, like water before the prow of a ship. He did not look at Lady Sybil. He did not look at Lord Trent. He did not look at the vicar, or the gaping congregation, or the weeping Maud. He looked only at Venetia. When he reached her, he stopped. For a moment, he simply stood there, this towering, terrifying man, and looked at the woman in the ruined dress with an expression that made several women in the front pew reach for their handkerchiefs. It was not pity. It was not anger, though anger was clearly there, banked like coals beneath a grate. It was something older and deeper, and more dangerous than either of those things. It was recognition. Without a word, he removed his coat. The wool was fine and dark and still warm from his body. He placed it around Venetia's shoulders with a gentleness that seemed impossible from hands so large, and he fastened the top button at her throat with fingers that did not tremble. "Your Grace," the vicar stammered, This is most irregular." Alistair ignored him. He was still looking at Venetia, who had been staring at the floor, who had been preparing herself for the long walk of shame back down the aisle. Slowly raised her eyes to meet his. Gray met gray. Storm met sea. "Miss Langley," he said, and his voice was low and steady and meant only for her, though every ear in the church strained to hear it. "You do not know me, but I know you. I have known you for 6 years, and I have come to take you home." The church erupted. Now I know what you are thinking. You are thinking, who is this man? Why has he been watching her? What does he want? And most importantly, can she trust him? These are the right questions. Keep them in mind. What happened in the immediate aftermath of the Duke of Harrogate's intervention was, by all accounts, chaos. Lady Sybil attempted to protest, but one look from Alistair silenced her with the effectiveness of a slammed door. Lord Trent had the good sense to remain quiet. The vicar fluttered. The congregation buzzed like a hive struck with a stick, and Venetia allowed herself to be led out of the church and into the waiting carriage of the Duke of Harrogate, because in that moment any destination was better than the one she was leaving behind. She did not speak during the carriage ride. Neither did he. She sat on one side, wrapped in his coat, which smelled of cedar and something darker, sandalwood, perhaps, or leather, and he sat on the other, his long legs angled to give her space, his eyes fixed on the passing countryside with a careful, deliberate neutrality that she would later recognize as the effort of a man restraining himself from looking at her the way he wanted to. They arrived at Harrogate Park as the sun was beginning to set. If Venetia had expected a cold and forbidding fortress to match its master's reputation, she was wrong. Harrogate Park was beautiful, a sprawling Palladian manor set in 200 acres of parkland, its honey-colored stone glowing amber in the evening light. There were gardens visible even from the drive, formal hedgerows giving way to wilder borders of roses and lavender, and somewhere, faintly, the sound of water from a fountain or stream. A housekeeper was waiting at the door. She was a stout, kind-faced woman of perhaps 60, with silver hair pinned beneath a lace cap, and eyes that took in Venetia's torn dress, borrowed coat, and shell-shocked expression without a flicker of surprise. "Mrs. Finch," Alistair said, "please prepare the East Suite for Miss Langley. She will need clothing, a bath, and dinner in her rooms." "Of course, Your Grace." Mrs. Finch's voice was warm. She took Venetia's arm with the practiced gentleness of someone who understood fragile things, and led her inside without asking a single question. Venetia was given a suite of rooms that was larger than the entire upper floor of her aunt's house. There was a sitting room with a fireplace already lit, a bedchamber with a canopy bed draped in pale blue silk, and a dressing room filled with— She stopped in the doorway and stared. Clothing, gowns, chemises, stockings, shawls, gloves, all in her size, all clearly new, all waiting as though someone had known she was coming. She turned to Mrs. Finch. "These cannot be for me. His Grace arranged them some weeks ago," Mrs. Finch said, with the careful blandness of a servant who knew more than she was permitted to say. "Some weeks ago, before the wedding, before the church, before any of it." Venetia sat down on the edge of the canopy bed and pressed her hands to her face. She did not cry. She had not cried in front of anyone since she was 16 years old, and she was not about to start now. But she sat there, in that beautiful room, in those beautiful clothes that had been chosen for her by a man she did not know, and she trembled. She ate dinner alone. She bathed alone. She lay in a bed, softer than anything she had ever experienced, and stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of what had happened to her. A duke had rescued her. A duke had been watching her for 6 years. A duke had prepared a room and a wardrobe for her before the wedding that was never meant to succeed. The question was not whether she could trust him. The question was whether she was brave enough to find out why. 3 days passed before Venetia saw him again, This was deliberate, she would later learn. Alistair had given strict instructions that she was to be left alone, fed well, given access to the library and the gardens and anything else she desired, and not pressured in any way. He did not visit. He did not send notes. He simply waited. It was Mrs. Finch who explained. "His Grace is a patient man," the housekeeper said, setting a tray of tea and seed cake on the table in Venetia's sitting room. "Perhaps the most patient man I have ever known. He will not rush you, Miss Langley. That is not his way." "What is his way?" Venetia asked. Mrs. Finch paused, teapot in hand, and looked at Venetia with an expression that was equal parts affection and warning. "His way is to decide what he wants, and then to pursue it with a thoroughness that most people find unsettling." "And what does he want?" The housekeeper poured the tea with steady hands. "I think, my dear, that is a question you should ask him yourself." On the fourth morning, Venetia went downstairs. She found him in the library. It was a magnificent room, 2 stories of shelves reaching from floor to ceiling, filled with more books than Venetia had seen in her entire life. Tall windows let in the morning light, which fell in golden rectangles across the polished floor. And there, in a leather chair by the window, sat the Duke of Harrowgate with a book open on his knee and a cup of coffee growing cold on the table beside him. He looked up when she entered. His expression did not change. It remained composed, controlled, unreadable. But something shifted behind his eyes. A flicker of warmth. A loosening of tension she had not realized was there. "Miss Langley." He rose immediately, setting the book aside. "Please, sit." She sat in the chair across from him and folded her hands in her lap. They looked at each other. The clock on the mantel ticked. "I have questions," she said. "I would be concerned if you did not. Why did you come to that church?" He was silent for a moment. The morning light caught the sharp line of his jaw and the shadows beneath his cheekbones, and she thought, with a detachment that surprised her, that he was not merely handsome, but beautiful, in the way that storms and cliffs and winter seas were beautiful, arresting, severe, and not entirely safe. "Because I could not stay away any longer," he said. "That is not an answer. It is the truest answer I have." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and for the first time she saw something crack in that granite composure, a rawness, a vulnerability that looked almost like pain. "I have known about your situation for 6 years, Miss Langley. I have known about your aunt's theft, your cousin's cruelty, your isolation. I have documentation of every shilling stolen from your inheritance. I have been waiting, impatiently, I confess, for the right moment to act." "6 years," she repeated. "You watched me for 6 years and did nothing?" The words landed like a slap. He absorbed them without flinching. "I did a great deal," he said quietly, "but none of it was visible to you. I built a legal case against your aunt. I tracked every transaction, every forged receipt, every fraudulent entry in her accounts. I waited because the law is slow, and because acting prematurely could have made your situation worse, not better. And I waited because—" He paused. His jaw tightened, "because I did not trust myself to approach you without—" Another pause. "Without making my intentions too clear." "And what are your intentions?" He held her gaze. "I intend to marry you, Miss Langley, if you will have me." The room went very quiet. "You don't know me," she said. "I know you better than anyone alive. That is precisely what frightens me." He nodded slowly. "I understand, and I will not rush you. You may stay at Harrogate Park as long as you wish, under any terms you choose. I have already instructed my solicitor to begin proceedings to recover your inheritance from Lady Sybil. Those proceedings will continue regardless of your answer to my proposal. You owe me nothing, Venetia. Nothing." It was the first time he had used her Christian name. The sound of it in his voice, low, careful, almost reverent, sent a shock through her that she felt in the soles of her feet. "I need time," she said. "Take all the time in the world," he replied. "I have been waiting 6 years. I am accustomed to patience. Now, it is important to understand what marriage meant for a woman in 1852, England, because without this context, you cannot fully grasp the weight of Alistair's proposal or the terror of Venetia's decision. Under the laws of coverture, a married woman ceased to exist as a legal entity independent of her husband. Her property became his property. Her income became his income. Even her children, should she have them, belonged to him in the eyes of the law. She could not sign contracts. She could not sue or be sued. She could not make a will. She was, in the most literal sense, absorbed into her husband's legal identity, as though her own had never existed at all. When Alistair proposed marriage to Venetia, he was not simply offering love or companionship or rescue. He was asking her to surrender the very independence she had only just begun to reclaim. And Venetia, who had spent 8 years as a dependent in a household that exploited her, understood this better than most. This is why her hesitation was not ingratitude. It was wisdom. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Venetia's life. She had expected to feel like a prisoner. Instead, she felt like a guest in a dream so beautiful she was afraid to move too quickly for fear of waking. She spent mornings in the library, reading anything and everything she pleased. She spent afternoons in the gardens, which were tended by an elderly gardener named Mr. Gibbs, who called her Miss with genuine respect, and showed her the roses that bloomed along the south wall. She ate meals in the dining room, a room large enough to seat 30, which felt absurd when she was the only one at the table, until the 5th evening, when she asked Mrs. Finch if the Duke would join her for dinner. He appeared that evening in a dark coat and waistcoat, his hair slightly damp from washing, and took his seat across from her with the careful precision of a man determined not to put a foot wrong. They ate roast pheasant and potatoes and drank wine that probably cost more than Venetia's entire wardrobe at Lady Sybil's house, and they talked. They talked about books. He had read everything she had read and more, and he argued with her about the ending of Villette with such passionate conviction that she forgot, for a moment, to be afraid of him. They talked about history. He was fascinated by the Wars of the Roses, which she found endlessly dramatic, and by the time they reached the reign of Richard III, they were both leaning across the table with their dessert forgotten. They did not talk about love. They did not talk about marriage. They did not talk about the church. But every evening, as she rose to retire, he would stand and say, "Good night, Venetia," in that low, careful voice, and every evening the sound of her name in his mouth felt a little more like something she wanted to keep hearing. On the 7th evening, she reached for the salt cellar at the same moment he did. Their fingers met, his bare, hers bare, because they were alone, and the formality of gloves at dinner had been quietly abandoned after the 3rd night. The contact lasted no more than a second. Skin against skin, warmth against warmth. but the shock of it ran through her like lightning through a copper rod, and she pulled her hand back so quickly that she knocked over her wine glass. He caught it. Of course he caught it. His reflexes were extraordinary, his hand closing around the crystal stem before a single drop could spill. He set it upright, and for a moment his fingers were wet with the wine that had splashed across his knuckles, and she stared at the red liquid on his skin and thought, absurdly, dangerously, I wonder what his hands taste like. "Forgive me," she said, and her voice came out strange. "There is nothing to forgive," he said. But he did not look at her for the rest of the meal, and she noticed that the hand that had touched hers was clenched in a fist beneath the table, as though he was holding something in. On the 9th evening, after dinner, he asked if she would like to walk in the garden. The air was warm for April, soft and fragrant, heavy with the scent of the first roses. A full moon hung low over the parkland, painting everything in shades of silver and shadow, and the gravel paths crunched softly beneath their feet. They walked in silence for a time. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that exists between two people who are acutely aware of the distance between their bodies and the effort required to maintain it. "Your gardens are beautiful," she said, because someone needed to say something before the silence consumed them both. They were not, until recently. I confess I neglected them for years. Mrs. Finch despaired. He paused beside a climbing rose that had wound itself around an iron arch. "I had them restored this spring." "This spring? Before the church?" "Yes." She stopped walking. "You restored the gardens before you came for me." He did not deny it. He stood in the moonlight with his hands clasped behind his back, and the shadows carved his face into something that looked almost like a confession. "The East Suite as well," he said quietly, "and the library. I added 300 volumes. Novels, mostly. The ones Mr. Poole reported you borrowed from your aunt's library when she was not looking." A pause. "I also had a pianoforte delivered. Mr. Poole mentioned you used to play before your aunt sold your mother's instrument." She could not speak. She stood on the moonlit path and looked at this man who had built a world for her, quietly, methodically, without ever knowing if she would step into it, and she felt something shift inside her chest. Not a breaking, a thawing. Ice that had been there so long she had forgotten it was ice, warming and cracking and beginning, slowly, to melt. "You are staring at me," he said. "You deserve to be stared at," she replied. "After a confession like that." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or hope, or the dangerous edge of both. He took a step toward her, just one. The distance between them shrank from 3 feet to 2, and she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could smell cedar and sandalwood and night air, and every nerve in her skin lit up like a candle wick touched by flame. "Venetia," he said, and his voice was rough in a way she had not heard before. Not controlled, not measured, but raw, as though her name had been scraped from somewhere deep inside him. "Yes?" He lifted his hand. Slowly, so slowly, she could have stepped back, could have turned away, could have done anything but what she actually did, which was to stand perfectly still and stop breathing. His fingers hovered beside her face, not touching. Close enough that she could feel the heat of them against her cheek. "I should not," he whispered. "No," she agreed. "You should not." Neither of them moved. The moment stretched. It stretched until it was as thin and taut as a violin string, until the slightest breath would have snapped it. His fingers trembled beside her face. She could see his pulse beating in his throat, rapid, urgent, utterly at odds with the iron control he wore like armor. And then somewhere in the darkness, "Hey?" Owl called, and the sound broke whatever spell had held them, and he stepped back as though burned. He dropped his hand to his side. He turned away from her and stared at the roses with the fixed intensity of a man who was using every ounce of his willpower to keep himself from doing something he could not take back. "Good night, Venetia," he said. His voice was steady again, but only just. "Good night, Alistair," she said. She went inside. She climbed the stairs. She closed the door of her suite behind her and leaned against it, and pressed her hands to her burning cheeks and thought, "I am in very serious trouble." On the 12th day, the jealousy arrived. She was descending the main staircase when the front door opened, and a woman swept in with the confidence of someone who had done it 100 times before. She was tall, golden-haired, and startlingly beautiful, the kind of beauty that made other women feel immediately inadequate. She wore a traveling dress of emerald green and carried herself with the easy grace of someone born to privilege. "Alistair," the woman called, pulling off her gloves. "I heard the most extraordinary rumor, and I simply had to come see for myself. They say you've installed a woman in Harrogate Park. Tell me it isn't true." Lady Vivian Ashby, daughter of the Marquis of Ashby. And, as Venetia would learn from Mrs. Finch within the hour, the woman who had been pursuing the Duke of Harrogate for the better part of 3 seasons. Venetia stood on the staircase unseen, and watched as Alistair emerged from his study to greet Lady Vivian with an expression of polite irritation. "Lady Vivian, you were not expected." "I never am, darling. That's what makes me exciting." She touched his arm with a familiarity that sent something hot and sharp through Venetia's chest, something she did not want to examine too closely. "Now, tell me about this girl." "Miss Langley is my guest." "That is all you need to know." "Your guest." Lady Vivian laughed, a bright, practiced sound. "Alistair, you have never had a guest in your life. You barely tolerate people in the same room as you. So either she is something more than a guest, or you have undergone a dramatic personality change, and I'm not sure which is more alarming." Venetia turned and went back up the stairs before she could hear his response. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself she had no claim on him, no right to feel the scalding heat that had risen in her chest at the sight of Lady Vivian's gloved hand on his sleeve. She told herself that she was a guest in his house, nothing more, and that whatever he had said in the library about marriage was a product of, what? Pity? Obligation? Some strange obsession that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the version of her he had constructed in his mind over 6 years of watching from a distance. She did not come down for dinner that night. At 9:30 there was a knock at her sitting-room door. She opened it to find not Alistair, but Mrs. Finch, carrying a tray and wearing an expression of gentle exasperation. "His Grace would like you to know," the housekeeper said, setting the tray down, "that Lady Vivian has departed. He would also like you to know that Lady Vivian is nothing to him, and has never been anything to him, and that if you are distressed by her visit, he will ensure it does not happen again." Venetia stared at the tray. There was soup, bread, cheese, and a single hothouse rose in a slender vase. The petals were the color of old ivory, faintly blushed with pink at their edges, and they trembled slightly in the draught from the open door. "He also," Mrs. Finch added, pausing at the door with one hand on the frame, and an expression that suggested she had seen many things in 35 years of service, but still found this particular situation remarkable. has not eaten his own dinner. He said he found he had no appetite when the chair across from him was empty. She left. Venetia sat down, picked up the rose, and held it to her face. It smelled like the garden. It smelled like home. And it smelled very faintly of him, because he had held it before placing it on the tray, and the warmth of his hands had pressed his scent into the petals. She knew this because she had, without meaning to, memorized the way he smelled, cedar and sandalwood and something darker beneath, like wood smoke on cold stone. She ate her dinner. She ate every bite. And when she was done, she placed the rose in a glass of water on her bedside table and fell asleep looking at it. And for the first time since arriving at Harrogate Park, she dreamt not of the church and the sound of tearing fabric, but of gray eyes and steady hands, and a voice that said her name like it was the only word that mattered. She found the journal on the 19th day. She had not been snooping. She wanted to be very clear about that, even to herself. She had been in the library, reaching for a volume of Keats on a high shelf, when she had knocked over a stack of books on the adjacent shelf. One of them fell open, and she picked it up to replace it, and her own name caught her eye. Miss Langley was in the garden today. She was wearing the gray dress, the one with the mended sleeve. She was reading beneath the apple tree. She did not see me. Venetia's blood went cold. She turned the page. Mr. Poole reports that Miss Langley has been confined to her room for 3 days. The reason is unclear, but appears to be punitive. I am finding it increasingly difficult to maintain the distance I have set for myself. Spoke to Carlyle about accelerating the legal proceedings. He advises patience. I am running out of it. And further, dreamt of her again, the gray eyes, the way she moves through a room as though trying to take up no space at all. One day I will give her all the space in the world. One day she will stand in the center of a room and know that every inch of it belongs to her. And 6 years I have waited. If Trent lays a hand on her, I will destroy him so completely that his own mother will not recognize the ruins. Venetia closed the journal. Her hands were shaking. Her heart was hammering. She stood in the library of Harrogate Park holding 6 years of obsession in her hands, and she did not know whether to run or to cry or to walk straight to his study and demand an explanation. Now, if you think you know where this is going, I promise you don't. Keep listening. She chose the third option. He was at his desk when she pushed the door, open without knocking. He looked up, startled, and then his gaze fell to the journal in her hands, and something very like fear crossed his face. "Venetia," she held up the journal, "you watched me." "Yes." "For 6 years." "Yes." "You knew about the gray dress. You knew about the apple tree. You knew about the days I was locked in my room." "Yes." "You dreamt about me." His jaw tightened. "Yes." "This is not normal, Alistair." "No, it is not." She stood in his doorway, holding his secrets, and looked at the man who had built a shrine to her out of observation and longing and 6 years of terrible disciplined restraint. And despite everything, despite the strangeness of it, despite the invasion of it, despite the small voice in her head that said, "This should frighten you," what she felt most was not fear. It was recognition. Because she had been invisible for 8 years, she had been looked through, looked past, looked down upon. And this man, this terrifying, powerful, impossible man, had looked at her, really, truly, unflinchingly looked at her, for 6 years, and had not looked away. "Why didn't you come sooner?" she whispered. The fear in his eyes shifted to something raw, something that looked like anguish. "Because I was afraid," he said, "that if I came to you too soon, with too much, you would run, and I could not." His voice cracked. The Duke of Harrogate, whose voice had never cracked in the presence of Parliament or peers or anyone, sat behind his desk and broke. "I could not bear to lose you before I ever had you." Venetia crossed the study. She set the journal on his desk, and she placed her hand, her bare, ungloved hand, against his cheek. He closed his eyes. A sound escaped him, not a word, not quite a breath. Something between the two that she felt vibrate against her palm. "You have me," she said, and she meant it. In that moment, standing in his study with her palm against his face and 6 years of longing, trembling between them, she meant it completely. But meaning something and being ready for it are not the same thing. And Venetia Langley, who had spent 8 years having every choice made for her by someone else, was not yet ready to make the biggest choice of her life in the heat of a moment. She pulled her hand away. His eyes opened. The loss in them, the sudden, devastating absence of her touch, was so visible that she almost reached for him again. Almost. But the journal was still on the desk between them, and the words inside it were still echoing in her skull. Dreamt of her again. 6 years. I will destroy him so completely. I need to leave, she said. The color drained from his face. Venetia, I need to think. I cannot think here. Not with you looking at me like that. Not with... She gestured at the journal, at the desk, at the study, at all of it. The beautiful prison she had traded for her ugly one. I am not saying no. I am saying I need to be certain that when I say yes, it is because I chose it. Not because I was rescued and had nowhere else to go. Not because you are kind and powerful and I am grateful. Because I chose you. Do you understand? He was silent for a long time. She watched the war play out across his face, the desperate need to keep her close battling against the promise he had made to never cage her, to let her go if that was what she needed. She watched restraint win, and it cost him. She could see what it cost him. "Where will you go?" he asked. "The village. There must be an inn. You will take the carriage, and Mrs. Finch will accompany you." "Alistair, this is not negotiable." His voice hardened, not with cruelty, but with the iron stubbornness of a man who would sooner cut off his own hand than let her walk into the world unprotected. "You may leave. I will not stop you. But you will not leave alone and on foot. That is the one condition I will not bend on." She nodded. "Very well." He stood. He crossed to the window and turned his back to her, and she saw his hands grip the windowsill so hard the wood creaked beneath his fingers. "How long?" he asked, without turning around. "I don't know." "Will you write to me?" "I don't know." A breath. It sounded like something breaking. "Then go," he said, "and know that I will be here. However long it takes, I will be here." She left Harrogate Park that afternoon, in the Duke's carriage, with Mrs. Finch beside her, radiating silent disapproval, and a trunk containing 3 of the new dresses and a volume of Keats she had slipped into her pocket without thinking. She did not look back. She wanted to. God help her, she wanted to. But she kept her eyes fixed on the road ahead, and her hands folded in her lap, and her jaw set against the tears that were threatening to fall, because she knew with a certainty that terrified her, that if she looked back and saw him standing at the window, she would tell the driver to stop, and she would run back to him, and she would never know if she had chosen him or simply collapsed into him out of exhaustion and fear. The inn in Aldbury was called the Bell. It was small, clean, respectable, and the innkeeper's wife, a stout woman named Mrs. Craddock, asked no questions when a well-dressed young woman arrived in a duke's carriage and requested rooms for an indefinite stay. Mrs. Finch took the adjoining room, made tea, set out biscuits, and then sat in a chair by the window and said, with the particular pointedness of a woman who has earned the right to speak her mind after 35 years of service, "He has not eaten since you left. Mr. Poole sent word." Mrs. Finch: "I am simply reporting facts, miss. I am not offering opinions. My opinion, should you ask for it, would be that the man has loved you since before you knew his name, and that he restored an entire estate for you, and that when you touched his face this afternoon, he looked as though he had been given the sun. But you did not ask for my opinion." "No," Venetia said, picking up a biscuit she would not eat. "I did not." 3 days passed. 3 days in which Venetia walked the lanes around Aldbury, visited her parents' grave in the churchyard where Alistair had first seen her. She knew this now, and the knowledge made the familiar headstones shimmer with new meaning, and tried to untangle the knotted threads of her own heart. Did she love him? She did not know. She knew that his absence was a physical sensation, a hollow ache beneath her ribs that worsened at mealtimes, when she sat across from an empty chair and understood, for the first time, what he had meant about having no appetite. She knew that she reached for books and thought of arguing with him about Villette. She knew that at night, in the narrow bed at the Bell, she pressed her face into her pillow and breathed in, and wished it smelled of cedar and sandalwood instead of laundered cotton, but wanting someone and trusting someone were different beasts entirely, and Venetia had learned through 8 years of brutal education that the people who were supposed to care for you were often the ones who destroyed you most completely. On the 3rd evening, everything changed. She was returning from her walk, alone, because Mrs. Finch had developed a head cold and was resting, when a carriage she did not recognize pulled to a stop on the lane ahead of her. The door opened, and Lord Jasper Trent stepped out. He looked different. The pleasant, easy-going facade had slipped, revealing something harder and meaner underneath, a man whose plans had been ruined and who was looking for someone to blame. His fair hair was disordered. His cravat was loose. He smelled faintly of brandy, though it was barely 5 o'clock. "Miss Langley," he said, and his voice was not pleasant at all. "Or, should I say, the Duke's little charity project. I've been looking for you." Venetia's heart began to pound. The lane was empty. The village was a quarter-mile behind her. The hedgerows on either side were too thick to push through. "Lord Trent, I have nothing to say to you." "No, because I have quite a lot to say to you." He stepped closer. His eyes were bloodshot and narrow with a spite that made her skin crawl. "You cost me £1,000. You know that? £1,000 and a wife. Now your Duke has bought up my debts, every last one, and my creditors are circling like wolves. I am ruined, Miss Langley, because of you. Because of your own gambling and your own debts. I had nothing to do with, you had everything to do with it." He seized her arm. His grip was brutal, fingers digging into the soft flesh above her elbow, hard enough to bruise, hard enough to hurt. She gasped. He pulled her closer, and the brandy on his breath was hot against her face. "Does your Duke know you're here? All alone, unprotected? Because I think he'd pay quite handsomely to get you back in one piece. Don't you?" Fear, real fear, cold and liquid flooding her veins like ice water. Not the dull, grinding fear of Lady Sybil's house, but the sharp, bright terror of immediate physical danger. His hand on her arm, his face too close to hers, the empty lane, the silence. "Let go of me," she said, and her voice did not tremble. 8 years of Lady Sybil had taught her that much, how to keep her voice steady when everything inside her was screaming. "I don't think I will." "I think," said a voice from behind them, "that you will." Lord Trent's head snapped around. Alistair Graves, Duke of Harrowgate, stood at the bend in the lane. He was on foot. He must have ridden from the estate and left his horse, and he was breathing hard as though he had been running, and his coat was gone, and his shirt was open at the collar, and his eyes. His eyes were terrifying. Venetia had thought she had seen his anger before. She had not. What she had seen was irritation, perhaps displeasure, perhaps the cold politeness that served as his public mask for fury. This was different. This was the thing that lived beneath all of that, the thing he kept locked away, the thing that had made him a legend in Parliament and a terror in business, and a man that other men crossed the street to avoid. His face was white, not pale, white, drained of every drop of color except for his eyes, which burned with a rage so absolute, so focused, so quietly catastrophic that Venetia felt it hit her like a wave of heat from a blast furnace. He did not shout. He did not run. He walked toward them with the slow, measured stride of a predator that has already decided how this ends, and every step he took seemed to make the air thicker, heavier, harder to breathe. Lord Trent released Venetia's arm. It was involuntary, the instinctive flinch of a prey animal recognizing a predator, and he stumbled backward, his bravado evaporating like dew in a furnace. "Your Grace, I was merely whose hand?" Alistair said, and the words were barely above a whisper. "Was on her arm. It was a misunderstanding." Alistair reached them. He did not look at Trent. He looked at Venetia. His gaze dropped to her arm, where the red marks of Trent's grip were already darkening into bruises on her pale skin. Something in his jaw tightened, a muscle ticking once, twice, and when he raised his eyes to Lord Trent, the man actually whimpered. "You touched her," Alistair said. His voice was conversational, almost gentle. It was the most frightening sound Venetia had ever heard. "You put your hands on her. You bruised her skin. You frightened her. I didn't mean. I am going to speak now, and you are going to listen. You are not going to interrupt. You are not going to explain. You are going to listen, and then you are going to leave England. And you are never going to return. You can't. I own your debts, Lord Trent. Every single one. I own the note on your mother's house in Bath. I own the mortgage on your brother's farm in Sussex. I own the debt your father left to the wine merchant in St. James's, the one he racked up over 20 years and never paid. I own you. And if you are still on English soil 1 month from today, I will call in every last shilling, and your mother will die in a workhouse, and your brother will lose his land, and your family name will be erased from the memory of decent society as though it never existed." Trent's face had gone the color of curdled milk. His mouth opened. No sound came out. "But that," Alistair continued, taking one final step forward until he was close enough that Trent could see the precise shade of fury in his eyes, "is merely the financial arrangement. I want you to understand something else, something personal." His voice dropped to a register so low that Venetia, standing 3 feet away, had to strain to hear it. If you ever speak her name again, if you ever look in her direction again, if I hear so much as a rumor that you have breathed the same air as my wife, I will not use solicitors. I will not use the courts. I will come for you myself. And what happens after that will not be a legal matter. Do we understand each other?" Lord Trent nodded. It was a frantic, jerking motion, like a puppet whose strings were being yanked. "Good. Your carriage is behind you. I suggest you use it." Trent scrambled into his carriage. The door slammed. The driver whipped the horses into motion, and in less than 30 seconds, the lane was empty again, and it was just Venetia and Alistair, standing in the fading light with the hedgerows rustling and the birds singing as though nothing had happened. The rage drained from his face. What replaced it was worse, raw, naked terror. Not for himself, for her. "Are you hurt?" His voice cracked on the word. He reached for her arm, then stopped, his hand hovering, just as it had in the garden, just as it always did, always asking permission, always holding himself back. "Venetia, are you hurt?" She looked at the bruises on her arm. She looked at his trembling hand. She looked at his face, this face that had been carved from granite and fury 2 minutes ago, and was now shattered with fear for her, only for her. And she understood, with a clarity that rang through her like a bell, that this was not obsession. This was not possession. This was not a man who wanted to own her. This was a man who would burn the world down to keep her safe, and then ask, with shaking hands, if she was all right. "I am not hurt," she said. And then she stepped forward, closed the distance he would never close himself, took his hovering hand, and pressed it against her cheek. The sound he made was not a word. It was something more honest than language, a ragged, broken exhalation that seemed to come from the very center of him. His fingers curled against her face. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone with a reverence that made her eyes sting. "Take me home," she said. "Home? Harrogate. Take me home." They rode back in silence. His horse led behind the carriage, her hand in his on the seat between them. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. The silence said everything. "I am here. I am yours. I am not leaving again. Now I know what you're waiting for. You're waiting for the revenge. You're waiting for Lady Sybil to get what's coming to her, for Maud to taste even a fraction of the humiliation they served to Venetia on that altar. I promise you, it is coming. And it is worth the wait. But first, the engagement. It was quiet. It was private. It happened on a Tuesday evening in the library, 6 weeks after the destroyed wedding, when Venetia looked at Alistair across the chessboard he was losing, which she suspected he was doing on purpose, and said, "Yes." He blinked. "Yes to what? To your proposal. Yes, I will marry you. Not because you rescued me, not because I have nowhere else to go, not because you are kind and I am grateful." She moved her queen across the board and captured his king. Checkmate. "Because I choose you. Because when I left, the only thing I could think about was coming back. Because when that man grabbed my arm, the only thing I wanted was you. Because I have spent 8 years being told I am worthless, and you are the only person who has ever made me believe otherwise. So yes, I will marry you, if the offer still stands." The chess piece in his hand, a black knight, fell to the floor. He did not pick it up. He sat very still, and for the first time since she had known him, his composure did not just crack, it shattered entirely. His eyes glistened. His hands trembled. He pressed them flat against the table as though anchoring himself to the earth. "You are certain," he said. and his voice was rough. "I have never been more certain of anything." He rose from his chair. He came around the table, and he dropped to his knees before her. This duke, this man who made Parliament nervous and society anxious, and pressed his forehead to her hands, and breathed her name like a prayer. "Venetia, Venetia." She threaded her fingers through his dark hair and felt him tremble beneath her touch. And she thought, this is what it means to be seen. Not glanced at, not assessed, seen. "I need you to know something," he said, without lifting his head. His voice was muffled against her hands, rough with an emotion he had held in check for 6 years. "I would have waited forever. If you had said no tonight, I would have waited. If you had said no 100 times, I would have waited. I would have spent the rest of my life in that chair across from you, losing at chess, watching you read, grateful for every moment you allowed me, and I would never, never have asked again. But I would not have stopped loving you. I do not know how." She bent her head until her lips brushed his hair. "You impossible man," she whispered. "Stop talking and look at me." He looked up. His eyes were bright, not quite tears, but the shimmering edge of them, held back by the same iron will that had kept him watching from a distance for 6 years. She cupped his face in both her hands. "I said yes," she reminded him. "I know," he said. "I am still trying to believe it." They were married 3 weeks later at the chapel on the Harrogate estate, with Mrs. Finch weeping in the front pew, and Mr. Gibbs the gardener standing as an unlikely but enthusiastic witness. Venetia wore a gown of ivory silk that Alistair had commissioned from the finest modiste in London, and when she walked toward him down the aisle of that small, beautiful chapel, he looked at her with an expression so nakedly adoring that Mrs. Finch's weeping intensified considerably. But the wedding was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of the reckoning. Now, when we speak of a duke's power in 1852 England, we are speaking of something that is almost impossible to fully comprehend today. With an income of £40,000 a year, in an era when a comfortable family could live on 300, the Duke of Harrogate commanded resources that rivaled small nations. He had influence in Parliament. He had connections in the judiciary. He had solicitors, barristers, and inquiry agents who answered to him alone. When such a man decided to destroy someone, the destruction was not a possibility, it was a certainty. And Alistair had been planning this for 6 years. The first strike fell on Lady Sybil. It arrived in the form of a letter from the firm of Hatchett and Carlyle, solicitors, informing Lady Sybil Langley that legal proceedings had been initiated to recover the full sum of Miss Venetia Langley's inheritance, £3,412, plus accrued interest, plus damages for mismanagement of a ward's estate. The evidence was catastrophic. Alistair's investigators had obtained copies of every falsified receipt, every diverted payment, every fraudulent ledger entry. They had sworn statements from servants. They had correspondence between Lady Sybil and her banker that explicitly discussed moving Venetia's funds into accounts bearing Lady Sybil's name. There was no defense. Lady Sybil's own solicitor told her so. But the legal proceedings were only the foundation. Alistair had built something far more devastating on top of them. He waited until the London season. He waited until Lady Sybil and Maud had arrived in town, had rented their usual townhouse, had begun the familiar rounds of balls and dinners and morning calls. He waited until they felt safe. And then, at the Countess of Harrington's ball, the most anticipated event of the season, attended by 400 of England's finest, Alistair and Venetia made their entrance. Can I just say, this next scene is why I love writing these stories. The ballroom was magnificent. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light across polished floors. The string quartet was playing something elegant and melancholy. 400 people in silk and jewels and immaculate evening dress were engaged in the serious business of being seen. And then the doors opened, and the Duke and Duchess of Harrogate were announced. Venetia entered that ballroom on her husband's arm, wearing a gown of midnight blue silk that made her gray eyes luminous. Around her throat hung the Harrogate sapphires, a necklace that had not been worn in public for 20 years, a family heirloom worth more than Lady Sybil's entire estate. Her dark hair was swept up and secured with diamond pins. She moved with a grace that was not studied, but natural, the grace of a woman who has finally, after years of making herself small, given herself permission to take up space. Every eye in the room turned to her. The whispers began immediately, a rising tide of them, spreading from the doors to the dance floor to the farthest corners of the room. That's her, the girl from the church, the one whose aunt— Did you hear what Lady Sybil and the Duke married her? The Duke of Harrogate? Good Lord, she's wearing the sapphires. Venetia heard all of it. She felt the weight of 400 gazes like sunlight through glass, warm on one side, sharp on the other. But she did not shrink. She did not lower her eyes. She walked through that ballroom on the arm of the man who had chosen her when no one else would, and she held her head high and she let them look. Let them look, let them see what worthless looked like when it wore sapphires. And across that glittering expanse, standing beside the punch bowl with a glass of champagne growing warm in her hand, Lady Sybil Langley saw her niece, the worthless girl, the charity case, the girl whose dress she had ripped apart at the altar, and the color drained from her face like water from a broken cup. Beside her, Maud made a small, strangled sound, like a rabbit that has just seen the shadow of a hawk. Alistair guided Venetia through the crowd. People parted before them, not with fear, but with the deference owed to a duke, and the curiosity owed to the most talked-about new bride of the season. The story of the church had spread, as stories always did, and every person in that ballroom knew some version of what had happened at St. Michael's in Oldbury. They stopped directly in front of Lady Sybil. "Lady Langley," Alistair said, and his voice was pleasant and cold, and carried just far enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "Allow me to present my wife, though I believe you already know each other." Lady Sybil's champagne glass shook in her hand. Maud, standing beside her mother in a pink dress that suddenly looked cheap next to Venetia's midnight blue, opened her mouth and closed it again without speaking. "Your Grace," Lady Sybil managed, congratulations on your marriage." "Thank you," Venetia said. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were calm. "Aunt Sybil, Maud, how lovely to see you." The two words, Aunt Sybil, landed like stones in a still pond. The ripples spread outward through the crowd. Whispers ignited. Fans fluttered. The story was being assembled in real time. The cruel aunt, the stolen inheritance, the ruined wedding, the Duke who had swept in and claimed the discarded bride. But Alistair was not finished. He turned to address the gathered crowd with the air of a man making a casual observation over brandy, though every word was calculated with surgical precision. "I should mention," he said, his voice carrying across the ballroom, "that my solicitors have recently concluded an investigation into the guardianship of my wife during her minority. they found some rather troubling discrepancies in the management of her estate. The matter is, of course, proceeding through legal channels, but I felt it only fair to mention it, since Lady Langley has been so generous in sharing information about my wife's personal circumstances with society. The implication was devastating and unmistakable. He was telling 400 people that Lady Sybil was a thief, without using the word, without making an accusation that could be challenged, but with a clarity that left no room for doubt. Lady Sybil's glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the marble floor. No one moved to help her clean it up. What happened next is something I need you to picture clearly, because it happened in real time, in front of 400 witnesses, and it was exquisite. Lady Sybil turned to leave. She gathered Maud by the elbow and attempted to navigate through the crowd toward the doors, her chin high, her back straight, performing dignity she no longer possessed. But society is a living thing, and it had already rendered its verdict. The first cut came from Lady Dorchester, a silver-haired dowager countess whose opinion could make or break a reputation with a single sentence. She was standing directly in Lady Sybil's path, and when Lady Sybil attempted to pass, Lady Dorchester turned her back. Not subtly, not accidentally. She turned her entire body away with the deliberate, unmistakable precision of a woman delivering a social execution. Lady Sybil flinched as though she had been struck. The second cut came from Mrs. Pemberton Clark, who had been Lady Sybil's closest friend for 15 years. When Lady Sybil reached for her arm, a desperate, clutching gesture, seeking any ally in the suddenly hostile room, Mrs. Pemberton Clark looked at Lady Sybil's hand on her sleeve, then looked at Lady Sybil's face and said, in a voice that carried, "I don't believe we are acquainted." 15 years of friendship, erased in 5 words, and then came Maud's moment. A young Viscount, Lord Farnham, a man Maud had danced with twice during the previous season and had believed to be a genuine prospect, was standing near the refreshment table. Maud, desperate for any semblance of normalcy, approached him with a smile that was cracking at the edges. "Lord Farnham," she said, reaching for a glass of champagne from the tray beside him, "how lovely to see you again. I was hoping—" He lifted the glass from her fingers before she could drink, simply took it from her hand, set it back on the tray, and said without looking at her, "That champagne is for guests." The word landed like a blade. Guests. Not you. You're not a guest here. You are not welcome. You are nothing. Maud's smile collapsed. Her lower lip began to tremble. She looked around the ballroom, at the averted gazes, the turned backs, the fans raised to hide whispered conversations that were unmistakably about her. And, for the first time in her pampered, privileged, pitiless life, she understood what it felt like to be Venetia. She understood what it felt like to stand in a room full of people and have not one of them see you as human. She burst into tears and fled through the nearest door, and not a single person followed her. I would like to say that I feel sorry for her, but I remember the sound of ripping fabric in a church, and I remember a 16-year-old girl bleeding onto a white petticoat, while her cousin called her worthless, and I find that my sympathy has limits. As for Lord Trent, he was already gone. He had boarded a packet boat to Calais the week before, as Alistair had promised, with nothing but a trunk and whatever remained of his dignity, which was very little. His mother's house in Bath was spared. Alistair had made that concession, not out of mercy for Trent, but because Lady Constance Trent, for all her sharp-faced ambition, had been the one to stand in that church and demand the truth about the dowry. She had, in her own mercenary way, been the first person to speak on Venetia's behalf that day. Alistair did not forget such things. Within 6 months, Lady Sybil's townhouse was sold to cover the legal judgment. The Hertfordshire house, the house where Venetia had spent 8 years in a room so narrow she could touch both walls, was seized by the court and awarded to Venetia as partial restitution. Venetia had it converted into a school for girls. She thought her mother would have liked that. Lady Sybil ended up in a rented cottage in a village no one had heard of, with a single servant she could barely afford, and a reputation so thoroughly destroyed that even the local vicar's wife refused her calls. Maud lived with her, unmarried, unvisited, unknown. And Venetia? Venetia bloomed. There is no other word for it. In the months following her marriage, the woman who had spent 8 years learning to disappear learned, instead, to be present. She hosted dinners at Harrogate Park that became legendary for their warmth and intellectual vigor. She restored the gardens to their former glory, working alongside Mr. Gibbs in the mornings, with dirt beneath her fingernails and sunlight on her face. She read voraciously, argued passionately, and laughed, really laughed with her whole body for the first time in years. And Alistair watched her do all of it with an expression that made Mrs. Finch, who had served the Graves family for 35 years, weep into her handkerchief on a regular basis. "You're staring." "Again," Venetia said one evening, looking up from her book to find him watching her from across the library. "I am always staring," he said. "I have been staring for 6 years. I see no reason to stop now. People will talk. People have been talking since I carried you out of that church. I find I do not care." She smiled. It was a small smile. She was still learning to give them freely, but it lit her face like a candle in a dark room. "Neither do I," she said. He crossed the room, took the book gently from her hands, set it on the table, and kissed her. Not the careful, restrained kisses he had given her before, the ones that felt like questions, like requests for permission. This one was an answer. This one was the 6 years of waiting distilled into a single, devastating press of his mouth against hers that left her breathless and trembling and absolutely certain that she had made the right choice. When he pulled back, his forehead resting against hers, his breath unsteady, she said, "6 years is a very long time to wait for someone. You," he said, "were worth every second." This is one of my favorite moments in this entire story. The way he looks at her here, not as a woman he rescued, not as a project or an obligation, but as the person he has loved in silence for 6 years. That is what makes this story different. He did not save her because she was helpless. He saved her because she was extraordinary, and he could not stand to watch extraordinary things be destroyed. Months later, on a winter evening at Harrogate Park, Venetia would find a final entry in his journal. One dated the morning of the ruined wedding, written before he left for the church. "Today I will see her. Today, after 6 years, I will stand in the same room and breathe the same air, and look into her eyes, and she will know I exist. I am terrified, not of her refusal, not of society's judgment, but of the possibility that I have built her into something she is not, that the woman I have loved from a distance will be a stranger up close. And yet, I would rather discover that the dream was only a dream than spend another day wondering. Forgive me, Venetia. I am coming." She closed the journal and held it against her chest. Through the window, she could see him in the garden below, hatless, coatless, despite the cold, talking to Mr. Gibbs about the spring planting, with an animation that would have astonished anyone who knew him only as the terrifying Duke of Harrogate. He looked up, as though he felt her watching. Their eyes met through the glass. He smiled. Not the controlled, careful expression he wore for the world, but a real smile, warm and crooked and entirely hers. She smiled back, and somewhere in Hertfordshire, in a rented cottage that was all she could now afford, Lady Sybil Langley sat alone in a room with no fire, no servants, and no one who cared whether she lived or died. And she understood, finally, completely, too, late, that worthless was not a word that had ever belonged to Venetia. It had always, only belonged to her. And that, my friends, is the story of Venetia Langley, who was stripped of her dignity at an altar and called worthless by the woman who should have protected her, and of Alistair Graves, the Duke of Harrogate, who watched and waited and loved, and finally, when the moment came, burned their world to ash. Not with fire, not with violence, but with the quiet, devastating, systematic destruction that only a man of infinite patience and infinite resources can deliver. I'm already working on the next story, and let me tell you, it might be even more intense than this one. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I'll see you soon.